On the 4th of November, 2008, in Grant Park, Chicago, a man walked out onto a stage in front of 250,000 people and said these words: "If there is anyone out there who still doubts that America is a place where all things are possible, tonight is your answer." The crowd wept. Veterans wept. Civil rights leaders who had marched beside Martin Luther King wept. People watching in living rooms across 150 countries wept. Because what had just happened was not simply an election. It was the moment a country looked at itself and chose to become something different from what it had been. Barack Hussein Obama had just been elected the 44th President of the United States. The first African American in history to hold that office. The son of a Kenyan goat herder and a white woman from Kansas. A man who, 47 years earlier, had been born into a world where, in many American states, his own parents' marriage was still illegal. But this is not a story about politics. This is a story about identity, about a boy who spent his entire childhood not knowing who he was, where he belonged, or whether the world had a place for him, and who answered those questions not by finding himself, but by building himself from almost nothing into one of the most consequential leaders the world has ever seen. Welcome to Visionary Chronicles. He was abandoned by his father at the age of 2. He grew up between continents, between cultures, between identities, never quite fitting anywhere. He experimented with cocaine as a teenager. He graduated from Harvard Law School and turned down a corporate career that would have made him a millionaire to go and work as a community organizer in one of the poorest neighborhoods in Chicago for $12,000 a year. He lost his first congressional race badly, and then, in the space of 4 extraordinary years, he delivered the most celebrated political speech of his generation, won a U.S. Senate seat, ran for the presidency against the most powerful political machine in the Democratic Party, and won. This is the full story of Barack Obama, and it begins in a maternity ward in Honolulu, Hawaii, on the 4th of August, 1961. Barack Hussein Obama II was born to 2 people whose union would have been, in many American states, a criminal act. His father, Barack Obama Sr., was a 25-year-old Kenyan student from the Luo tribe, the son of a goat herder from a small village near Lake Victoria. His mother, Stanley Ann Dunham, known as Ann, was an 18-year-old white woman from Wichita, Kansas, raised by a furniture salesman and a bank teller. They had met at the University of Hawaii, where Barack Sr. was one of the very first African students ever admitted on a scholarship. Hawaii was a new state. It had only joined the Union in 1959 and was, by American standards, remarkably free of the racial segregation that still scarred the mainland. Even so, the marriage of a black African man and a white American woman was unusual, to say the very least. Ann's parents, Stanley and Madeline Dunham, had reservations. Barack Sr.'s family in Kenya had serious objections. He had, they pointed out, already married a woman named Kezia back home, by whom he had children. None of this stopped the marriage. Nothing, it seemed, stopped Ann Dunham from doing exactly what she believed was right. Barack Jr. was born in August 1961, and then, when he was just 2 years old, his father left, not simply to another city or another state. Barack Sr. returned to Kenya and then went on to Harvard for his graduate studies. He would see his son only once more in his life, a single visit to Hawaii when Barack was 10 years old. And then Barack Sr. would die in a car accident in Nairobi in 1982, a disappointed and largely tragic figure, having squandered enormous promise through a combination of brilliance, arrogance, and alcoholism. The father Barack Obama knew as a child, then, was largely a mythology, a figure conjured from stories his mother told him, from a single photograph of a thin, serious-looking man in a suit, from the exotic resonance of a name that made other children stare. He grew up with a ghost for a father. It shaped everything. When Barack was 6, Anne married again. Her second husband was Lolo Soetoro, an Indonesian man she had met at the University of Hawaii. In 1967, the family relocated to Jakarta. For 4 years, Barack lived in Indonesia, a country still recovering from a violent military coup that had left hundreds of thousands dead. He attended local schools. He learned to speak Indonesian fluently. He ate rice and fermented soybean and dog meat, went to school barefoot, and navigated a country and a culture entirely unlike anything he had known in Hawaii. Lolo Soetoro was a kind stepfather, and Barack liked him. But Anne grew increasingly concerned about the quality of education her son was receiving, about Indonesia's limitations, and about what she wanted for his future. When Barack was 10, she sent him back to Hawaii to live with his maternal grandparents, Stanley and Madeline Dunham, while she and his younger half-sister Maya remained in Indonesia. It was, by any measure, a difficult thing to do to a 10-year-old boy. And Barack, now living in Honolulu, attending the prestigious Punahou School on a scholarship, surrounded by the children of Hawaii's wealthy elite, began to feel, for the first time with real intensity, a question that would define the next decade of his life. Who am I? He was not black in the way his black classmates were black. He had not grown up in America, had not experienced American racism in his body, had not shared the cultural references or the history or the music. He was not white. His skin made that clear to everyone, including himself, every single day. He was not Hawaiian, not Indonesian, not Kenyan. He was something new, something that didn't have a name or a community or a roadmap. He was, in his own words, a mutt, a collection of contradictions searching for a coherent self. His grandparents loved him fiercely and did their best. His grandfather Stanley, a dreamer, a storyteller, a man who had followed opportunity across the country without ever quite catching it, became his male role model. His grandmother Madeline, who rose to become one of the first female vice presidents at the Bank of Hawaii, was the family's real anchor, the quiet competence beneath all the dreaming. At Punahou, Barack was popular, good at basketball, and deeply uncertain beneath the surface ease. He made friends, found mentors in his teachers, and began, slowly, haltingly, to construct an identity. He also, as he would later admit, with unusual candor for a politician, began using marijuana and occasionally cocaine, not as a rebel act, but as an anesthetic. Junkie, pothead, he wrote later. That's where I was headed, the final, fatal role of the young man who reasons that he is smarter than the system and sees no good reason why he shouldn't get what he can get. He pulled back. Something turned in him, perhaps the dawning realization that his grandmother, working double shifts to pay his school fees, deserved better. Perhaps simply the survival instinct of a young man with too much to lose. In 1979, Barack Obama enrolled at Occidental College in Los Angeles. He was, by his own admission, still drifting. He partied. He philosophized. He played basketball. He began, haltingly, to find his political voice, giving his first public speech on apartheid divestment at a student rally. He felt the electricity of a crowd for the first time. Something clicked. After 2 years at Occidental, he transferred to Columbia University in New York City. This was a deliberate choice, a deliberate reaching for something more serious. New York in the early 1980s was a city in crisis. Crack cocaine, AIDS, deindustrialization, racial tension, thick as weather. Barack lived frugally in a small apartment in Harlem, ran along the Hudson River every morning, read voraciously, Nietzsche, Baldwin, Ellison, Malcolm X, and began, slowly, to knit together the pieces of himself into something coherent. He graduated from Columbia in 1983 with a degree in political science, and then he made a choice that, to most of his classmates, seemed inexplicable. He turned down every lucrative option available to a Columbia graduate and went to work as a community organizer on the south side of Chicago. His salary, $12,000 a year. His job, to work with the residents of some of the city's poorest, most neglected neighborhoods, former steel workers who had lost their jobs when the mills closed, families living in housing projects with broken heating and asbestos in the walls, communities that the city's political machine had been promising to help for generations and consistently failing. He was 24 years old, from Hawaii by way of Indonesia and Kansas, and he knew almost nothing about Chicago or its people. He was initially a disaster. He called meetings that nobody came to. He drafted proposals that went nowhere. He knocked on doors and was told, politely and impolitely, to go away. But he listened. He kept listening. And slowly, over 3 years of grinding, unglamorous, frequently demoralizing work, he began to understand something about power, how it was accumulated, how it was used, how ordinary people could build it for themselves if they organized and acted together. Those 3 years on the south side of Chicago were, he would later say, the making of him. Not because of what he accomplished. The accomplishments were modest, but because of what he learned about America from the inside, about what it felt like to be poor and black and invisible in a rich country, about the gap between the country's promises and its realities, about what real leadership, patient, unglamorous, rooted in genuine relationship, actually required. In 1988, Barack Obama enrolled at Harvard Law School. He arrived as a curiosity, a community organizer, not the usual type of ambition, and left as a legend. In his second year, he was elected president of the Harvard Law Review, the most prestigious student-edited law journal in the United States. He was the first African American ever to hold that position in the Review's 104-year history. The election made national news. Barack Obama was 28 years old, and the world was beginning to notice. He graduated magna cum laude in 1991 and returned to Chicago, turning down offers from top law firms and federal clerkships that would have made him wealthy and comfortable within years. Instead, he joined a small civil rights firm, taught constitutional law at the University of Chicago, and continued his work in community organization. He also began writing, working on the memoir that would become Dreams from My Father, a searingly honest account of his search for identity that remains one of the finest political memoirs ever written. And then, in 1992, he met Michelle Robinson. Michelle LaVaughn Robinson had grown up on the south side of Chicago, the daughter of a pump operator at the city's water filtration plant, and a stay-at-home mother. She had attended Princeton and then Harvard Law School on scholarships and had returned to Chicago to work at a corporate law firm. When Barack arrived at the firm as a summer associate, Michelle was assigned as his advisor. She was not immediately impressed. She was professional, reserved, focused. Barack asked her out repeatedly. She repeatedly declined. She finally relented, took him to a community event on the South Side, watched him speak to a room full of strangers, connecting with each of them, seeing each of them, and something shifted. They were married in 1992. Their daughters, Malia and Sasha, were born in 1998 and 2001. In 1996, Barack Obama was elected to the Illinois State Senate. He was a good state senator, pragmatic, effective, focused on practical legislation around healthcare access, criminal justice reform, and ethics. But the state legislature felt small to him. In 2000, he challenged Congressman Bobby Rush in a Democratic primary for a U.S. House seat. Rush, a former Black Panther and a genuine hero to many in the district, destroyed him. Barack won just 30% of the vote. It was a humbling, painful defeat, made worse by a series of additional indignities. His credit card was declined trying to rent a car. His request to attend a key vote was rejected by a staff member who didn't recognize him, and his 2-year-old daughter Malia was sick throughout the campaign. He nearly quit. He and Michelle talked seriously about leaving politics entirely. The debt was real, the defeats were real, the sacrifice was real, and the results were, so far, modest. Michelle was not enthusiastic about continuing. Barack persisted. Something in him, the stubbornness of a man who had been rebuilding himself since childhood, refused to concede. In 2002, with the Iraq War debate at its height, Barack Obama stood up at an anti-war rally in Chicago and said, clearly and on the record, that the war was wrong, that it was a dumb war, a rash war. He said this before it was fashionable to say it, before the evidence of how catastrophically wrong the invasion would go had become undeniable. It was a genuine act of political courage. It would, years later, become one of his most important differentiators. In 2004, Barack Obama ran for the U.S. Senate, and then something happened that changed everything. John Kerry, the Democratic presidential nominee, invited the relatively unknown Illinois state senator to deliver the keynote address at the Democratic National Convention in Boston. The speech he gave on the 27th of July, 2004, is one of the most extraordinary pieces of political oratory in American history. He stood before the nation, not yet a senator, not yet a household name, and said, "There is not a liberal America and a conservative America. There is the United States of America. There is not a Black America and a white America and Latino America and Asian America. There's the United States of America." The hall was electric. The television audience was millions. Within days, Barack Obama was a national figure. He won his Senate seat that November in a landslide. And within months, people were already asking the question, some seriously, some as a kind of fantasy, whether this man could be president. Barack Obama announced his candidacy for the presidency on the 10th of February 2007, standing in sub-freezing temperatures in Springfield, Illinois, the city where Abraham Lincoln had launched his own political career. He was 35 days into his first U.S. Senate term. He was 45 years old. He was, by most professional assessments, at least a decade too early. The Democratic primary campaign against Hillary Clinton was one of the most dramatic political contests in American history. Clinton was the prohibitive favorite, experienced, funded, backed by the entire establishment of the Democratic Party, and supported by the majority of African American voters, who initially did not believe that America would actually elect a Black president and did not want to waste their votes on a dream. Obama's campaign was built on something different: small donations, grassroots organization, and a message of hope so earnest, so direct, so unpolitician-like, that it generated an energy unlike anything the Democratic Party had seen since Robert Kennedy. He won the Iowa caucus, a state that is 93% white, and the calculus changed overnight. If Iowa would vote for Barack Obama, perhaps America would. The campaign that followed was 18 months of extraordinary intensity. The Reverend Wright controversy, the race speech in Philadelphia that many consider the finest address on race in America since King, the grinding primary battle through all 50 states, the general election against John McCain, the financial crisis that erupted in September 2008 and reordered everything. On the 4th of November 2008, Barack Obama received 69 million votes, more than any presidential candidate in American history. He carried states that had voted Republican for decades. He won with an electoral college margin of 365 to 173. The presidency Barack Obama inherited was a catastrophe in slow motion. The financial system was on the edge of collapse. The worst economic crisis since the Great Depression was already underway. 2 wars were consuming American lives and treasure. The country's global standing had been severely damaged, and the expectations placed on the new president, by Americans, by the world, by history itself, were so enormous as to be almost paralyzing. He moved with extraordinary speed. Within weeks of taking office, he signed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, an $800 billion stimulus package that most economists credit with preventing a full economic depression. He stabilized the banking system, saved the American automobile industry, and began the long, grinding work of reversing the slide. His signature domestic achievement was the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, signed into law in March 2010. It was the most significant expansion of healthcare coverage in the United States since Medicare in 1965, extending coverage to more than 20 million previously uninsured Americans. It was also one of the most politically costly pieces of legislation in modern American history, costing the Democrats their House majority in the 2010 midterms and generating a level of political opposition that, over a decade later, has still not fully subsided. On the 2nd of May 2011, Barack Obama sat in the White House Situation Room and watched, in real time, as U.S. Navy SEALs raided a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, and killed Osama bin Laden, the architect of the September 11th attacks, who had been the most wanted man in the world for nearly a decade. The decision to authorize the raid had been Obama's alone. His intelligence advisors were split. The risks, a failed mission, a diplomatic catastrophe, a firefight in a sovereign country, were enormous. He gave the order anyway. In 2009, Barack Obama was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, a decision that generated controversy even among his supporters, given that he had been in office for less than a year. He accepted it with characteristic honesty, acknowledging openly that he had done little yet to deserve it, and using the occasion to deliver a nuanced, serious address on the nature of war and justice that surprised many who expected easy platitudes. He was re-elected in 2012, defeating Republican nominee Mitt Romney by a margin that, while smaller than 2008, confirmed that his first victory had not been an anomaly. In his second term, he oversaw the legalization of same-sex marriage nationwide through a Supreme Court ruling, negotiated the Paris Agreement on climate change, opened diplomatic relations with Cuba after 50 years of hostility, and concluded the Iran nuclear deal. He also confronted the limits of his own power, the failure to close Guantanamo Bay, the expansion of drone warfare that he himself expressed deep ambivalence about, the Syria red line that was drawn and not enforced, the rise of the Islamic State, and a Republican Congress that blocked virtually everything he attempted in his second term. Barack Obama was a man who understood, better than most, the gap between the world as it should be and the world as it is. He left office on the 20th of January 2017 with an approval rating of 59%, higher than Ronald Reagan, higher than Bill Clinton, higher than almost any two-term president in modern American history. The economy he left behind had seen 75 consecutive months of private sector job growth, the longest streak on record. The unemployment rate had fallen from 10% to 4.7%. The deficit had been cut by more than 2/3. Michelle Obama left the White House as one of the most admired women in the world, having used her platform to launch initiatives on childhood obesity, education, and military families that were, by any measure, genuinely consequential. Their daughters, Malia and Sasha, who had arrived at the White House as a 10-year-old and a 7-year-old, left as young women, poised, grounded, apparently undamaged by 8 years of living in the most scrutinized address on earth. What do we take from the life of Barack Obama? The first lesson is about identity, specifically about the freedom that comes from building your own. Barack Obama spent the first 30 years of his life with no inherited identity that fit him, no community, no tradition, no clear answer to the question of who he was. For a long time, this felt like a wound. Later, he came to understand it as a gift, because it forced him to choose, deliberately and consciously, who he wanted to be. The self he constructed was not given to him. He built it, and that made it, in some fundamental way, his own in a way that an inherited identity never can be. The second lesson is about the relationship between patience and ambition. Barack Obama is one of the most ambitious people of his generation, and one of the most patient. These two qualities seem contradictory. In him, they were not. He waited, he built, he lost, badly, and he rebuilt. He spent years in a state legislature that felt beneath him, doing unglamorous work without complaint, banking experience and relationships and the quiet credibility that comes from showing up consistently over time. His rise, when it came, looked sudden. It was the opposite of sudden. It was the result of 2 decades of preparation. The third lesson is about the power of language. Barack Obama understood, more than almost any political figure of his era, that the way you say something is as important as what you say. The 2004 keynote address did not succeed because it contained original ideas. The ideas were not especially new. It succeeded because it expressed something real and true about America in a way that made people feel seen. The greatest leaders are not the ones with the best policies. They are the ones who can tell a people the story of themselves in a way that makes them want to be better. And the fourth lesson, the one that perhaps resonates most in this particular moment, is about the difference between cynicism and hope. Cynicism is easy. Cynicism is safe. If you expect nothing, you are never disappointed. Barack Obama spent his entire career arguing, against all evidence and against considerable personal cost, that hope was not naivety, that choosing to believe in the possibility of change was not weakness, that the most sophisticated, most intelligent, most realistic thing a person could do was to refuse to accept that the world could not be made better. He was right. Not always, not completely, but fundamentally, irreducibly right in a way that the cynics, with all their sophistication, all their worldliness, all their comfortable distance from disappointment, were not. The boy from Hawaii who did not know who he was became the man who told a country who it could be, not because he was born to it, because he chose it, because he built it, because he refused, in the face of abandonment, confusion, failure, and doubt, to stop believing it was possible. That is what it means to be a visionary. This has been Visionary Chronicles. Subscribe for a new, extraordinary life every Thursday. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it.